Make sure they can see me on here. Okay. Welcome back. I know most of you probably don't know me yet, so I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Rakav. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I am now a student at Creighton University. And I am here because I got a 36 on the ACT a few years ago, and I'm here to help you guys do the same. And I'm going to be focusing on English. Yeah, there's not much more to say. I'm going to start with the test overview. I don't know how much you guys know about the test. Can I quick get a raise of hand? How many have taken the test before? Okay, amazing. Not very many people have. Cool. So the English portion is the first thing you're going to face. I'm going to give you just a few tiny notes in general about the test, and then we'll dive into one topic today we're going to be focusing on basically the whole time. You won't need anything other than a notebook and a pencil today. So let's start by, the English test is 5 passages. You're going to have 75 questions. And you're going to have 45 minutes to do it. So that might seem a little bit fast. I know this isn't math, but obviously we're going to have 15 questions per passage here. And if we are working at the correct speed, we'd be aiming for about 9 minutes per passage. Obviously, you can go a little over and a little under depending on how difficult each passage is, but in general, that's what we're aiming for. And it's kind of weird because when you hear the title ACT English, the English test, it's kind of weird because you all speak English, so you should all do really well. But it's not that simple because they're asking about things that you maybe not super familiar with. So the two main things it's going to test you on, there's going to be two main things. The first one, sorry, let me refer to this quick, is your usage and mechanics. And the second one is your rhetoric skills. Or sorry, rhetorical skills, I should say. You'll notice there's no spelling on here, so please excuse me if I spell something wrong. I'm a very bad speller, but luckily you're not getting tested on that either, so it doesn't matter if you are. I'll break these down a little bit more here in a minute, but in general, what you should think of is these questions are going to be easy. And I'm going to put quotes around easy because it's not to say that they are easier to do. They should just go faster. And to me, I like to quantify those as easier, and these are going to be harder, let's say. So the breakdown as it normally goes, and this may vary a little bit now, the test likes to do some new stuff nowadays, but in general, the pattern they're aiming for is about 40 easy questions and about 35 harder questions. Can you guys see this okay? I know, I'm sorry, a little bit far away for people in the back. Can you guys see it okay? Good? Okay. Yeah, so you're going to have 40 easy questions and 35 harder ones. Now, what I mean by easy and hard is, I said a little bit before, it's more about timing than actual difficulty of getting the question correct. So in general, I would say you should spend 5 to 10 seconds on easy questions. And it may take anywhere from 15 seconds to a minute for a harder question. So the big difference is the timing. It's not that you're going to get one of them right more often than the other. A lot of the times that's not the case, but you'll spend less time on easy questions than in comparison to hard ones. Okay, now a little smaller breakdown. I'm not going to write this down because I don't think you guys care that much, but the three things that fit into usage and mechanics are punctuation, grammar usage, and sentence structure. Now those are those are the three things that fit into the easy category. Punctuation is about 13% of the test, grammar and usage is about 16%, and then sentence structure is about 24%. So sentence structure matters a lot. And we'll come to talk about that in a few weeks here, but those are the easy questions. And then the harder ones, or the rhetorical skills, are going to be covering organization, strategy, and author style. Organization covers about 15% of the test, strategy covers about 16%, and author style covers about 16%. So if you want to add those up, they add up to 100. But basically it's just saying there's 6 main things that they're going to test you on, and I'm only going to be here 5 times. So we're going to try to squeeze them together as much as we can. We still have to practice as much as we can, but I like to cover at least something in those 6 little points each week that I'm here. This week, I want to focus on punctuation, which is the smallest category, but to me, it's the easiest. If we learn all of the rules there could possibly be, no one's going to get a punctuation question wrong. And to me, to be honest, that's what makes or breaks your score. Is if you get the easy questions correct, then there's going to be a floor for your score, and we don't know what that ceiling could be. Now, if you don't get your easy ones, you might have a ceiling, but you could drop down really low. So I think it's really important that we're getting these. I think punctuation is the easiest, and it's really important that we're getting the easiest questions correct, because all it takes is for us to learn the rules. That's all. Some general information I want to give you about the ACT English test before we get into punctuation specifically is, first of all, forget that you all speak English for a second. I know you all do. This test isn't going to test you on stuff like that. The passages are going to come out, and you're going to read them, and they're going to underline certain portions, and they're going to tell you to change them or not to change them, basically. That's what the test is going to look like. And it's important to remember you are an editor during this test. You're not an author. So don't think of it as a writer. Think of it as someone who's trying to correct someone else's writing. So don't try to be creative. Don't try to what sounds best. Do what you know is best. Do what you know by the rules that we're going to learn across these weeks. I know I just said forget it, but also you all speak English. So, trust yourself. You all know how grammar and punctuation is supposed to sound. Now, I know, obviously, there's times we don't do it. When we're speaking, we don't use punctuation. So you can't tell where a comma goes and where it doesn't sometimes. But you all read a ton. Even if you don't read books, you read text messages, you read the news, hopefully. I don't know if people do that anymore. But you read all the time. You see words all the time. So trust yourself. You actually know a lot more than you think you do. There's going to be some rules here that I'm going to tell you that go against your intuition and what you think you know. And that's okay. So the main point is trust yourself when you have to and know when not to trust yourself. Third is, I'm going to say this is going to sound dumb, but I want you guys, when you're taking the test, to be as positive as possible. And what I mean by that is it's really easy and sometimes the ACT does this on purpose. I'll give you an example. They'll make the first question really, really, really hard. It'll be one of these. It'll be some organizational question, and it's really confusing. And the idea, what they're trying to do is throw you off right away. If the first question is hard, it makes the rest of the test feel worse. Now all of a sudden you have one question wrong, maybe the next one doesn't go as well, maybe the next one doesn't go as well, and now all of a sudden you're missing easy questions because you just feel less good. So what I want you to remember is this test has the most questions out of any ACT section. You have 75 questions to prove you know what you're doing. So if one question you're unsure about, that's okay. Forget about it, move on to the next question. It's important that you're staying as positive as possible and don't let one bad question ruin an easier one that comes on later. And finally, this I'm going to talk about more in depth, probably next week, but it'll jump into one of the other sections that isn't punctuation. But remember, less is more. It's a rule that we use all the time in ACT English, and we call it the economy rule. Basically, it just means if you can say something in less words, use less words. All of us want to use less energy. So, in general, you're going to see this come up with punctuation too. There might be an answer choice that has 6 commas in it. And sometimes people love picking those type of answers because there's so many commas and that's what looks right. But just remember, in general, things are supposed to be simple. The world is supposed to be simple. So you want to pick things that, if you can do it in less words, do it in less words. All right, let's get to punctuation. I would like, if everyone can open up a new page in their notebook. I like to do this every single time I teach this class. We do this for the first lesson. And I know the 2 guys in the back took this class last year, and I want you to tell everyone it's helpful. We're going to make kind of a cheat sheet that is going to have every single punctuation rule you could possibly encounter on the ACT. Now, I made this cheat sheet with my tutor when I was your guys in these seats exactly. And I looked at it for about 2 weeks, for 5 minutes before I went to bed. And after that, I never looked at it again. I don't know what happened to it, but I'm never going to forget the rules. So basically, the reason I'm telling you this is it's easy. All you have to do is study it a little bit for a few days in a row, and you'll never forget these rules. Most of them you already know. There's going to be a few that are kind of tricky, but most of them you already know. So if you spend a little bit of time just studying, it's all going to go really well. Let's start with commas. This is the most common thing you're going to see on the ACT. Commas are the most common punctuation mark in English, and it's not even close. We see commas all the time, and a lot of these rules you already know, but some of them are a little more tricky or less obvious. So we'll talk about those ones more in depth. The way I'm going to do this, I'm going to write down the rule, and I'm going to give an example for all of them, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. If anyone needs more examples, just don't be afraid to talk. This class is completely okay to talk during. Yeah, let's just go into the first rule. So the first thing, commas set off items in a list. Now, I'm sure most of you know this one already, right? If you, let's talk about why it's important, actually, then, with this example. I don't know if you guys have seen one like this before. This is a really common example English teachers who think they're funny use all the time. So I don't know if you guys have seen this in school. But the sentence says, I love cooking, my family, and my pets. Now, with those commas, that makes a ton of sense. If you were to remove the commas, and it said, I love cooking, my family, and my pets, kind of changed the meaning quite a bit. So it's important that we use commas in lists. And in general, you're going to use them all the way up to the last word. So normally, we think of lists as 3 items. Cooking, my family, and my pets. So this word is almost always going to be and or. We're going to use a comma in front of that on the ACT. Does anyone, not you two in the back, does anyone know what this comma is called? Okay, do you guys know it? Oxford comma, good. So there is a debate amongst people who are like English nerds, and some of them don't use this comma, and they think this is okay for a list, that I love cooking, my family, and my pets, and they think this takes the place of a comma. If you think that, that's perfectly fine. On the ACT, we're still going to use the Oxford comma. So whenever you have a list, you're going to separate each and every item on the list, even if it's in front of the last word, with the comma. Does that make sense? Does anyone want another example? No? All right, let's move on. What did I use? Okay. The next rule. Commas are going to separate some different stuff. First thing is they're going to separate cities and states. And they're also going to separate days and years. Does that make sense? I'm going to give you an example in a minute here. I'll let you guys write that down. So, for example, where we are right now, like that, where there's going to be a comma between the city and the state. So we're going to say Sioux City, South Dakota with a comma. And then the same goes with days and years. Between the day and the year. So if I'm talking about a specific date, December 31st, 2022, the comma goes in between the day and the year. Does that make sense? Okay, now just be careful. I've seen this once before where they'll put a month without a day, and you actually don't need a comma here. December 2022 is fine like that. You don't need a comma to separate those. It's only between days and years. Days and not months. Does that make sense? Does anyone want more examples? Online people, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question too. Sorry, I didn't say that at the beginning. Okay. Now, those two are pretty straightforward. I'm sure most of you, if you didn't know that rule exactly, you've used it before. Most of you know that one, those ones pretty well. Now, this one is a little bit different, and we might start using some words haven't heard of before. Commas, they set off. I don't know how to spell this word actually. Hold on. Subordinating? Subordinating. There we go. Okay, commas are going to set off subordinating or dependent clauses. I'm sure you've heard dependent clause in school before, and for the purpose of the ACT, you can assume subordinating and dependent kind of mean the same thing. That's just basically a clause that can't stand by itself. It's not a whole sentence. So if I were to say, I went to the grocery store, that's a independent clause. That's a sentence. If I were to say, because I went to the grocery store, and if I just stopped there, that's not a sentence because it started with the word that made it a dependent clause. Now there has to be something else to follow it. So, if you have a subordinating or dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence, you have to have a comma before you continue on with the rest of the sentence. So, for example, alright, although I scored 60 points, my team lost the game. So more often than not, the second clause you're going to see in something like this is going to be independent. So my team lost the game. It's perfectly fine by itself. Although I scored 60 points, obviously can't stand by itself. It's a subordinating or a dependent clause. So that means you need a comma after it before you continue on to the rest of the sentence. Does that make sense for everyone? Would anyone like another example? We good? Online people, are we okay? All right, I'll take that as a yes. Let's go on to the next one. Commas are going to set off or introduce quotes. This is a fairly new thing. The ACT doesn't love using this one. When I took the test, this rule didn't even exist for the ACT. They didn't test on it. Now they've thrown some questions on it, but it's pretty simple. When there's quotations, you use a comma. You might say, and set off and introduce, I'll explain why they're two different things, but alright, so that's an example of a sentence there. And this is you're introducing quotations. So you're saying, I asked myself, comma, why did I do that? And when you do something like this, when you're introducing a quote like this, the comma is going to go outside of the quotations. So, yeah. And then you might also have I guess that one uses a question mark. That's not great, is it? Oh, maybe I should say. Whoops. Sorry, guys. Forgot my example. Okay, sorry. That is the other type of comma you're going to use to set off at the end. So if you start a sentence with quotation marks, you're going to have one right before the end of it, of the quotation, and that's if it doesn't end in some sort of punctuation already, like a question mark or an exclamation point. Yeah, but notice this time it's inside the quotations, it's not outside. So if you're ending quotations, you're going to put it on the inside. Does that make sense? Does anyone want another example? Good? I'm going to assume online is good because I haven't said anything. Let's go to the next one. Okay, this one's a little bit tricky, so we might have to spend a little more time on this. Commas, set off. Gotta know how to spell this word, hold on. There are two P's. Appositives Does anyone, excluding the two guys in the back, does anyone know what an appositive is? I didn't either. Do you guys know what it is?
The comma.
Not quite. It falls into that. It goes into that rule sometimes, but not exactly. I'm gonna say what it is, and if you don't want to listen to this part, don't, because I'll explain it in more understandable terms. But the technical definition is that it's a noun phrase, or a noun clause that follows a noun to describe or rename it. So that sounds like kind of a mess, but basically what that means is anytime you're talking about something and you land on a noun, and that noun may be unclear or it may not be, it's just something that you want to expand on a little bit more, then you would put a comma there, and you'd expand on it a little bit, and then you'd continue the rest of the sentence. So you're just like further explaining a noun that maybe needs a little more explanation. So for example, let's talk about somebody that I really, really hope everyone knows, but if they don't, that's okay. I'll explain it with... Okay, now I've stumbled across a noun. I'm assuming most of you know who that is, but let's say you don't, and I'm talking to a more general public. If I want to further explain or rename this noun, I could set off and add in a positive. So that a positive might be, can we all agree is the greatest ever? Yeah? Okay, so I don't know, did he score last week? Probably.
Every match.
Yeah, so he scored last week. Good. My sentence makes sense. Okay, so we're going to get to another rule that explains why this one is here. But in general, what we did there was we had a noun. We came across a point where we wanted to explain it more. We wanted to add in a positive, so we did. And we added a comma in front of the appositive. I'll just say another example in case someone wants it. If we're talking about... actually, no, that example sucks. I was going to talk about LeBron James, too, but whatever. It's kind of the same example. Does this make sense? Are we good? Online people, do you guys want another example? I'm going to assume no. Cool. All right. This one's another pretty simple one. Wait, hold up. I got to check my wording. You're going to use a comma anytime right after you address someone by name. So anytime, we kind of already do this, if you think about it. And just to be clear, mom and dad are considered names. Stuff like that where you're directly like talking to someone, you're still going to assume that's addressing someone by name. So if your mom's yelling at you and she's like, Rakov, do the dishes. We don't really hear that, but what she means is, Rakov, comma, do the dishes. So, what's your name?
Sophie.
Okay, so if I'm really, really mad at Sophie, and I'm yelling at her to do her homework, it's going to be, comma, do your homework. So there has to be a comma there anytime you address anyone by name. Does that make sense? I feel like that one's pretty simple. Anytime you address someone by name, you use a comma. But there's not much more to express with that one. Is everyone, we good? Move on? All right. This one might be your most common comma rule. And I know the two in the back mentioned this one already. I'm not really going to say too much about it right away in the rule, but what I wrote in my same cheat sheet you guys are making right now is comma hug. I'll expand on what that means a little bit, but basically this is the most common rule, and this is one we do all the time. There's times when you're talking and before you continue your sentence, there's something that interrupts that thought. That's maybe not essential, but like you just want to get in there. And that's a non-essential or like interrupting phrase. When you're saying that all the way through, you're going to hug it with commas. So that means you're going to put a comma in front of it and a comma after it. So I'll finish writing this actually. Comma hugs around non-essential. How do you spell essential? What the heck? Essential erupting. There we go. This is just proof you don't have to be good at spelling to be good at the ACT. I'm very, very bad at this. But okay, so you're going to put comma hugs around any non-essential or interrupting information. Let's say Sophie's responding to me now and she's giving me an excuse of why she didn't do her homework. Have you said... Okay, this is a completely reasonable response, right? I tried several times to do my homework, but let's say she wants to address the fact that I told her specifically, you have to do your homework. Now she could say, like you said, to do your homework. Okay, now the point I'm trying to make here is, what if I cross off this section? Does that sentence still make sense? I tried several times to do my homework. Is that okay? Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Now this is non-essential information, you might say. That, okay, it adds to the sentence, but it doesn't have to be there. You could write the sentence perfectly fine without it. So anytime you have something like that, you're going to give it a hug. So you're going to put a comma before it and a comma after it. Does that make sense? Do I have another example in here? I can come up with another one if anyone needs one. We good with that? Make sense? Okay. Online, you guys get it? Okay, that's fine. Let's go on to the next one. All right, this one, I think most of you will probably already know. Everyone knows what an adjective is? We'll come back to talking about it, actually. Okay, commas have to be put around adjectives describing the same noun. I guess I should say modifying, that's correct, but describing is fine too. So, adjectives modifying the same noun. So, I know we only use one adjective a lot when we're talking, but there is times, specifically when you're writing, more adjectives like... Okay, you were to say something like this. These two, smart and handsome, are both things that are describing the tutor. So since they're both adjectives describing the same noun, we're going to put a comma in between. That's all. So everyone knows what adjectives are? I guess I forgot to say that. Adjectives are basically any words that describe a noun. So you could say like the quick fox instead of just the fox. Or the smart, handsome tutor rather than just the tutor. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you have multiple adjectives that are describing the same noun, you're going to use commas in between them. We good with that? Has everyone had time to write this down? Sorry. Good? Awesome. All right. That was what, number 8? Okay, I have one last rule for you for commas. And I would say this one's also pretty important. If you're going to take away 2 that maybe you didn't know already, it would be the comma hug and this one. I think those are the 2 most important ones because The rest of them, I'm sure you probably already had some sort of understanding for. This one has a big, long explanation for it, but I'm not going to tell you that because it doesn't help you. So what I like to think of it as, this is how I write it in my notes. So this is a type of sentence, a structure of sentence that we use so much that we probably, it's like really surprising how much. Almost every single sentence you say follows this exact structure. So this IND stands for independent. So you're going to have independent, comma, fanboys, independent. Have you guys heard of fanboys words before? We talked about it in school a little. Yeah? So basically they're like connecting words or coordinating words. Coordinating conjunctions, I think is what they're called. So that'll be like for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Words like that. And a lot of the times we're going to have an independent clause, and we're not done with the sentence. We want to say and another independent clause. I went to the store and I bought milk. Let's do that one. It's a really great example. Wow. Got ahead of myself. Now, I should have done this before. Blah. Now you all know the rules, so you know. But this looks perfectly fine if you think about it. Like, we say stuff like this all the time. I went to the store and I bought milk. When I'm saying that, there's no pause, there's no comma there. But actually, we have an independent clause. I went to the store. That can stand alone. I bought milk. That can stand alone. And we have a fanboys in between. So because of that, we actually do need a comma here. So this is one that might go against your intuition and what your English-speaking brain thinks. Because a lot of the times when we have a sentence like this, when we're saying it, we don't add a pause. So this one can be a little bit tricky. There might be times where you see something like, I went to the store and bought milk. Now, a lot of people think this is the same thing. It's not. So let's go through the same process we did before. I went to the store. That's independent. That can stand alone. How about bought milk? It's not a sentence. Can't have that be alone. It's not an independent clause. That's a dependent clause. So if you have an independent clause, a fanboys word, and a dependent clause, you don't need a comma. So this one is something you really have to know the rule for. You can't just trust your intuition on this, because it won't work. Your intuition isn't going to tell you which one of these is right. But you have to remember, if you have two independent clauses and a fanboys, you need a comma. And if you don't have two independent clauses, don't worry about it. No comma. Does that make sense for everybody? Do we need another example? Are we good? Cool. Does everyone get this written down? Awesome. Okay, that's every single kind of comma you're going to see on the ACT. If you see a comma and it doesn't fit one of these things, it's not right. I promise. So don't be, there's a book you guys read for your homework, the ACT 36 book, that has this phrase I really like that says, don't be comma happy and don't be comma phobic. Where don't use too little commas because you're nervous about them, and don't use too many because I just gave you all the rules, and if they don't follow that, then they're not right. So don't get comma happy. And that's a common problem we have. Let's talk about colons. Colons are the two little dots, like that. Colons don't have a ton of rules. There's 4 of them, and they kind of all fit the same mold, but we'll talk about them all individually. The first one is that they... No, I'm right. They introduce lists. So you can use a colon to indicate a list basically anytime. And it might seem a little bit weird when you do it, but like, it might be as simple as literally it might say something like, I bought the following, and then it'll give you a list. Like that. So it might say something where I bought the following, and then give you a list. There also might be a world where, does everyone have this sort of written down? Sorry, I don't want to rush. I'll give you another second. There also might be a world where this isn't here. And it might say, I went to the store and bought eggs, cheese, and bread. That's also correct. And on top of that, to make this feel even more confusing, you could also just not have that there. And you could just say, I went to the store and bought eggs, cheese, and bread. It's perfectly fine. So the ACT is never going to ask you to pick between this and that. They're not going to say which one is correct. They might give you this and this. Well, now you know which one's correct because I, went to the store and bought. That's not right. So then it's the colon one. So there might be times where you need one and there might be times where you don't. And you just have to watch out for both of them. But the main idea is that they're going to introduce lists for you. Does that make sense? I know the colon rules can get a little bit confusing, so don't hesitate if you guys don't get it. It's okay, we can talk about it. And I'll do a better job explaining. Are we good with this one? Okay, awesome. The second one we have here is, does everyone know how a period works? You put a period at the end of a sentence, the end of independent clauses? Well, you can actually use a colon for that too. Kind of seems insane that you can use, and there's going to be another type of punctuation we're going to come on to that you can also use to separate clauses, which it actually makes it pretty confusing. There's 3 different things you can use in place of a period, which is surprising. But yeah, it can separate independent clauses, and the reason you would pick a colon instead of a period might be, well, what linguists think it is that it's providing emphasis. So it's just maybe connecting the 2 clauses a little bit more. But again, like I said before, that's something for an author to choose, right? And on the ACT, we are not authors, we are editors. So it's not our place to say, oh, you should use a colon instead of a period. So there'll be times where if you see both a colon and a period and nothing else in the answer choices are different, eliminate them both. Because they will never make you pick between a colon and a period if it's this type of colon. They're following one of the other rules, of course, but hold on. Where's my example? Let's say like now, this is more the type of sentence you'll see when a colon instead of a period is being used. Excuse me. My reason for saying this is simple. The teacher said so. So these are 2 independent clauses. They could stand completely on their own, and you could put a period here, and that would be correct too. But you can also use a colon to provide emphasis or like connect the 2 thoughts a little bit more. Does that make sense? This is one of the things I really don't like about English, that you can just use different things, but just be aware. You probably won't see this come up on the ACT, but it's possible, so just be aware of that. This one's a little bit more common. You see with colons, you could introduce a wait, that's not right. How do you spell clarification? Okay, you're going to introduce a clarification or explanation. Yeah, so again, you might see something as simple as, let me clarify what I mean by, so like, I'll just write that down actually. I don't know, what do we need to clarify? So you could explain something like that. Let me clarify what I meant by goat, the greatest of all time. So it might literally tell you, let me clarify what I mean, or something like that. That's going to indicate like, hey, I'm about to use a colon. But it might not always be that simple. It might be like, this kind of falls into that rule too, I guess I'm thinking, that you're clarifying or explaining your reason. You could have stuff like that too. But most of the time when they want you to know this rule, they'll say something like, let me clarify, or like some sort of clear indicator that they want a colon. Does that make sense? Okay, last one. And you can use a colon to introduce quotes. Again, you can use a comma for this too. There's times that, again, it's kind of hard to pick between a comma and a colon in that scenario. So more often than not, it'll be like something. Might see it more like that, where I believe in the age-old saying, colon, practice makes perfect. So something like that. It may not always be he said, she said type of thing, but that's also possible. You could have he said, colon, whatever he said. That's perfectly fine too. Yeah, so colons are a little bit confusing. They kind of, a lot of their rules, other punctuation marks can also do. So that's what makes them especially tricky, but are we good with these? We got these rules down? Okay, online? Good? Okay. I'm gonna move on to the next thing here. The next one we're going to do, I think, is semicolons, which only have two rules. Yeah, semi. Oh, I used black for this, didn't I? Oops. So, it's like a colon but a comma on the bottom instead of the two dots. The main rule, and I won't even give an example for this one because you guys know this one, I just said it. You can separate independent clauses, but I like to think of this rule as just use it like a period. And like I said before, this one is 100 times more common than using a colon to separate clauses. If you ever see any scenario where there's a period and a colon and two answer choices, and the rest of the answer choices are exactly the same, you should eliminate them both right away. Because the ACT is never going to make you pick between a semicolon and a period. That's an author's choice, not an editor's choice. So they're not going to make you do that. Does that make sense? We're just going to pretend it's period. Not much more to say about that one. The second one's kind of interesting. And I like to call it a super comma. Now, I didn't know this rule until the second time I took the ACT. And it didn't come up the first time, but it did the second time, so it's possible you might see this, but it's very rare. I've used it a few times in my life. Basically, a super comma is, let's say when we use lists, we're separating with commas, right? We've talked about that. Let's say I'm listing cities, and I'm talking about my favorite city, Sioux Falls, and I'm talking about New York. And I'm also talking about Omaha. Now, obviously, I didn't actually write a sentence with this, but do you see how overwhelming this is? How many commas are here? Sioux Falls, comma, South Dakota, comma, New York, comma, Omaha, comma, Nebraska, comma. Just so many commas. And we could go on here and list more cities, but the point that linguists think is this is ridiculous. There's too many commas. I don't even know what you're listing anymore. Are you listing cities and then states? Are you listing cities and states as one? It's extremely confusing. So when you're listing something that already has commas in it, then instead of using commas to separate each one, you're going to use semicolons and pretend they're super commas, that they're stronger than that comma, and they'll separate those items in that list. So now it's clear that we're listing Sioux Falls, South Dakota, New York, and Omaha, Nebraska, rather than Sioux Falls, South Dakota, New York, Omaha, Nebraska. That's just too much. That's confusing. So they want to have a stronger comma, basically, to separate items like this. Does that make sense? Cool. Is everyone good? Can I erase it? Good. Cool. All right, that's all I have for you for semicolons. There's only those two rules, and even then those two are kind of rare, but let's talk about apostrophes. That's a hard word to spell, so I'm going to... And that's what an apostrophe looks like. Imagine a comma and you flipped it upside down. So now it's on the higher side instead of the lower side. Apostrophes are only used for one thing. So when you see an apostrophe, you should think ownership. Obviously there's conjunctions too, like they are versus their. You know, you could put, that's another thing. But I'm assuming, this class assumes that you guys already know that. You know that it is, when you put an apostrophe, it becomes its, or they are, it becomes their. So those type of things they expect you already know. So when we see an apostrophe that isn't a conjunction, we're going to assume it's ownership. And there's a bunch of different rules that go along with ownership. It's kind of interesting. Let's start with, if you have a word that, a singular, wow, that's not right, is it? Singular, there we go. And you want to show ownership, you're just going to add apostrophe S, no matter what the last letter is. So if I want to talk about, what's your name? Elaine. How do you spell that? S. E-L-L-A-I-N-E. A-I-N-E. I would have never guessed that. Okay, if we're talking about her books, we're going to say Elaine's books. All we did was add an apostrophe and an S. Let's say we're talking about, now this part's easy, we can all do that. Let's say we're talking about Chris. This is where it gets confusing. Chris ends in an S. So sometimes it can be hard that like, well, this kind of looks wrong for a lot of people. Chris is what? But that's correct. Anytime it's something singular, it's going to be apostrophe S, even if that word ends in an S. Now, if we go to a plural word, then we're going to do just the apostrophe. So a plural word, sorry, I should clarify that. Plural word that ends in S. Should make that clear. A plural. Wow, that's kind of hard. A plural word that ends in S. So, what did I write down as my example? All right, let's go with. This is a funny example I like that it shows you where you place your apostrophe makes a big difference. So let's put it the more natural way, the way it should be, like that. So if you're saying, I couldn't decide which of my girlfriend's dresses I liked best. If it's like this, that means you're saying, oh, your girlfriend has multiple dresses and you can't decide which one you like the best. That's really nice. If you put the apostrophe on the outside, now you have multiple girlfriends. I couldn't decide which one of my girlfriend's dress I like the best. Now you're thinking, oh, there's 3 girlfriends and they're all wearing a dress and I don't know which one of them I like best. So that completely changes the meaning. So be careful with where you place your apostrophes. And another one, this one I'm not going to write an example for, but actually I probably don't even need a rule for this one. If you have a hyphenated word or a compound word, for example, like, if you have like son-in-law, that's a hyphenated word. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It has hyphens in between. You shouldn't put sons-ins-laws. You should just put son-in-laws. So on hyphenated words, you're only going to add an apostrophe on the last word. And then there's going to be one more last rule that is, oops, that's 4. If you put an apostrophe on just the last noun, you have joint possession. And if you put it on all nouns, I'll explain what this means in a second. Separate. Oops. Separate possession. We're running low on time, so I'm trying to speed a little bit, but you're going to have separate possession if you put it on all nouns. Will one of you tell me your name? Either of you, I don't care. Anaya. Okay. Let's say Anaya and I have this house, and we share it on the beach. Then that means we would say Anaya and I's house, or Anaya and me's house, or whatever. But you're just putting it on the last noun. So Anaya and Rakav's house is really pretty. Great. If you were to put it on all of the nouns, so if I said Anaya's and Rakav's houses, that means we live in 2 separate houses. So if you put it on just the last noun, that means it's joint possession. You both are sharing that thing. If you put it on all of the nouns, then it's... Wait, what did I just say? Yeah, okay, that's right. It's joint possession if you put it on the last noun, and if you put it on all of the nouns, it's separate possession. They're different things. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. We have 2 more rules, or 2 more punctuation marks. Let's trying to rush you guys a little bit. They're going to be dashes and hyphens are the last 2. Dashes are long like that. Hyphens are short like that. Dashes basically only have 2 rules. Let's cover those ones quick first because they're easier. So the first dash rule is a dash hug. That's familiar. We know a comma hug already. A dash hug is basically the same thing, but it's a little bit more powerful. Again, it just means you can add interrupting words in the middle of a sentence. Except the dash hug, you can also put an entire sentence in the middle of a sentence and just hug it with the dash, which is, it's crazy, but more often than not, this is the dash rule you're going to see. So Manoj likes to say, if you see a dash, look for another one. There's probably going to be another one. There's going to be some sort of hug. So what did I put for my example? my preparation for the ACT, dash, doing what the tutor said to do, dash, ensured that I would do well. So do you see there was that huge interrupting phrase in the middle, and we just put dashes on either side of it. The other rule is a dash can help you add words to the end of a sentence. So you can just decide I want to add a few words to the end of the sentence, and you can do that with a dash. So, for example, we were never going to win the game. That was the end of the sentence I really wanted to put. And then I could say dash, unless, of course, their best player got hurt. So I just added words to the end of a sentence there, and you can do that with a dash. So this one I would only use when there's a clear break in flow of the sentence. You can continue without it, but I would only use it when there's a clear break in flow. Does that make sense? Okay, last few rules here. Hyphens, they're a little bit shorter. They go between words. The first one is you're going to connect numbers and words. So if I'm talking about, oh my gosh, this guy's so tall. He's 7 foot tall. Or maybe I'm talking about how old someone is. They're like 7-year-old, like that. So you're going to put hyphens in between those. So anytime you're connecting a number with a word, and it doesn't matter if it's a number like this or if it's written out. It's always going to have hyphens in between. Does that make sense? All right. The next one, when you have great relatives or in-laws. So your great-grandpa is your great-grandpa. And your brother-in-law is your brother-in-law. Does that make sense? So great and in-laws always going to have hyphens in between them. Are we good with that overall? Good? Okay. The third one, anytime you start a word, and let me not say anytime, but anytime you start a compound word with self, and there's so many examples of this, you're going to put a hyphen in between. So you could say self-directed, self-employed, self-esteem, self-confidence. All of those words are self-hyphen whatever. So self is one of those words you're basically always going to have a hyphen after. Just remember that. That one's hard, so let's spell that one last. If you are... Hey, like 1 minute. I'm almost done. If you're spelling out fractions, you're going to use hyphens in between those. So like 2/3, like that. You're going to put a hyphen in between them. That looks like neat. Does that make sense? All right. And your last rule is if you have a combination word that includes a prepositional phrase. Sounds like a lot. We'll talk about it in a second. But if you have something that includes a prepositional phrase, now I like to think of those more as, the way I learned them were idiomatic expressions, is what they were called. They're little combination words, almost like analogies we use in English in general, and they contain some sort of preposition. So like, popular ones are like jack of all trades. So that would be jack hyphen of hyphen all hyphen trades. So anytime you have a prepositional phrase inside of a combination word like this, so this is one of them, jack of all trades. Down in the dumps is another one. 1 in a million. Has anyone heard of Johnny on the spot? That's another one.
That is old.
That's a little old. Might be over this crowd a little, but Yeah, prepositional phrases are always going to have hyphens in between them. And that is all of the punctuation you could possibly see on the ACT. So if you get a chance, even if it's for 5 minutes, try to study this paper you just wrote for a little bit. And in like 2 weeks, you're never going to get another punctuation question wrong. So